There's a strange tension that many people feel in certain relationships but struggle to explain. It's not open hostility. It's not direct conflict. On the surface, everything appears normal. Polite conversations, occasional smiles, even moments that look like friendliness. But beneath that surface, something feels off. A subtle discomfort, a sense that the energy is not genuine, and that feeling is often your first clue that you are dealing with something far more complicated than simple dislike. Because some people don't hate you loudly, they hate you quietly. And the psychology behind quiet hatred is far more dangerous than open opposition. When someone openly dislikes you, the situation is clear. Their intentions are visible. Their behavior matches their emotions. But when someone secretly resents you, they operate in a completely different psychological space. Their hostility hides behind politeness, sarcasm, passive remarks, and subtle actions that are easy to dismiss individually but revealing when seen as a pattern. And that pattern usually begins with one uncomfortable truth. About human nature, people often resent what reflects their own insecurities. Many individuals are not disturbed by someone being successful, confident, intelligent, or admired. What disturbs them is standing next to someone who exposes what they believe they lack. In psychology, this is often linked to comparison anxiety. Human beings constantly evaluate themselves through comparison with others. When someone around them highlights their perceived weaknesses, the emotional response is rarely admiration. More often, it is resentment, but open resentment carries social consequences. Society rewards politeness and cooperation. So instead of expressing dislike directly, people learn to mask it. They maintain the appearance of neutrality while quietly allowing their frustration to leak out in small ways. A dismissive comment here, a lack of enthusiasm there, a subtle attempt to minimize your achievements, and if you pay attention, you'll notice something fascinating about these interactions. The hostility is rarely strong enough to confront directly, yet persistent enough to create emotional tension. This is the psychology of concealed hostility. It allows someone to maintain their image as a reasonable person while still expressing their resentment in indirect ways. One of the most common behaviors in this dynamic is subtle invalidation. A person who secretly resents you will rarely attack you openly, but they will consistently reduce the value of what you do. If you share a success, they might respond with indifference. If you express excitement about something, they may quickly shift the conversation or respond with lukewarm acknowledgement. The goal is not necessarily to hurt you directly. The goal is to prevent you from occupying psychological space that makes them uncomfortable. In many cases, this behavior is not even fully conscious. People are remarkably skilled at rationalizing their emotions. Instead of recognizing their resentment, they convince themselves that they are simply being realistic, objective, or even helpful. And this is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because when someone secretly dislikes you, they rarely see themselves as hostile. In their mind, they are simply reacting to your behavior. This self-justification allows the resentment to continue without triggering guilt. Over time, these small behaviors create an atmosphere of quiet tension that many people feel but cannot easily explain. They notice that certain individuals respond differently to them compared to others. Conversations feel slightly colder. Support feels conditional. Praise feels rare or forced. And eventually, they begin questioning their own perception. Maybe they're imagining things. Maybe that person is just having a bad day. This is one of the most psychologically destabilizing aspects of hidden hostility. It introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity forces the brain into constant analysis. Humans naturally try to resolve uncertainty. When signals are mixed, friendliness combined with subtle negativity, the mind begins searching for explanations. This mental loop consumes energy and attention, and ironically, it often benefits the person who holds the resentment, because their hostility remains subtle enough to avoid confrontation, while still creating emotional pressure in the relationship. Another fascinating element of secret resentment is the role of status and identity. People form strong attachments to how they see themselves. They want to believe they are competent, respected, and valuable. When someone appears in their environment who unintentionally challenges that self-image, the mind searches for ways to restore balance. Sometimes that means improving themselves. But improvement requires effort and humility. And for many individuals, it is psychologically easier to devalue the person triggering the comparison. Instead of thinking, maybe I should grow, the mind shifts toward, maybe they're not as impressive as people think. That small shift protects the ego. It transforms admiration into criticism. And once that transformation occurs, resentment quietly begins to grow. What makes this particularly interesting is that the person being resented often has no idea why the tension exists. They may have done nothing intentionally harmful. Their only offense might be competence, confidence, or authenticity. And yet, the emotional reaction they receive from others suggests something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Psychologists often describe this dynamic as projection. When individuals struggle with their own insecurities, they sometimes project negative motives onto others to justify their feelings. Instead of acknowledging envy or inadequacy, they reinterpret the other person's behavior as arrogance, insensitivity, or manipulation. This reinterpretation allows them to maintain moral superiority while still harboring resentment. and once this narrative forms, their interactions begin to reflect it. They may become more critical, less supportive, or subtly competitive. The important thing to understand here is that secret hatred rarely appears suddenly. It develops gradually through small psychological shifts: comparison, insecurity, projection, and silent resentment. By the time the tension becomes noticeable, the emotional pattern has often been building for a long time. And recognizing these patterns is the first step in understanding the hidden psychology of people who secretly dislike you. Because when resentment hides behind politeness, the real story is rarely found in what people say. It is revealed in the small, consistent signals that most people overlook. Once you begin to understand that hidden resentment often grows quietly beneath polite behavior, the next step is recognizing how it actually manifests in everyday interactions. Because people who secretly dislike you rarely reveal themselves through obvious hostility. Their behavior operates in subtle psychological patterns that are easy to miss if you only focus on words. In fact, words are often the least reliable indicator of someone's true emotional state. What reveals concealed resentment is consistency, small reactions that repeat over time. One of the first patterns appears in the form of restrained acknowledgement. When someone secretly resents you, they often struggle to celebrate your progress. Not because your achievements directly harm them, but because your progress intensifies the comparison already happening in their mind. Human psychology naturally measures self-worth through relative standing. If someone feels insecure about their own trajectory, watching someone else move forward can trigger a quiet sense of inadequacy. Instead of confronting that discomfort internally, the mind looks for ways to soften the impact. And one of the simplest ways is by minimizing the significance of your success. So when you share good news, the reaction might appear supportive on the surface but lack genuine enthusiasm. The response might be brief, distracted, or quickly redirected toward another topic. This type of interaction rarely feels aggressive, but it carries an unmistakable emotional distance. Over time, the absence of sincere encouragement begins to form a pattern. Another common signal is subtle contradiction. People who secretly harbor resentment often feel an unconscious urge to challenge your perspectives more frequently than others do. It may appear as constant disagreement over small matters or the tendency to play devil's advocate in conversations that don't require debate. At first glance, this can be mistaken for intellectual engagement. Healthy discussions involve different viewpoints, but the key difference lies in intention. In constructive conversations, disagreement aims to explore ideas. In resentment-driven interactions, disagreement aims to destabilize confidence. The goal is not to find truth together, but to subtly undermine your sense of authority or competence. These micro-challengers create an environment where you constantly feel the need to defend your reasoning, even when the topic itself is insignificant. Over time, this repeated pattern can shift the psychological balance of the relationship. Instead of interacting freely, you begin monitoring your words more carefully. You anticipate resistance, and that anticipation gradually drains the natural ease that healthy relationships should have. Another revealing behavior is passive comparison. People who secretly dislike you may frequently bring up others in ways that subtly place you in competition. They might highlight someone else's accomplishments immediately after you mention your own, or frame conversations in a way that shifts attention away from you. This is rarely done in an obvious or confrontational way. Instead, it appears disguised as casual conversation, but psychologically, it serves a clear purpose. By redirecting recognition towards someone else, they protect themselves from the discomfort of acknowledging your position too strongly. In many cases, this behavior stems from identity preservation. If someone's sense of worth depends on being perceived as capable or impressive, witnessing another person occupy that space can feel threatening. Rather than openly competing, they adjust the narrative of the conversation to rebalance attention. What makes this dynamic particularly confusing is that each individual action is small. None of these behaviors alone seem severe enough to justify confrontation. But patterns matter far more than isolated moments. And when these small signals accumulate, they begin to reveal a consistent psychological orientation toward you. Another subtle pattern appears in the form of selective support. People who secretly resent you often show enthusiasm for others while remaining noticeably neutral toward you. In group environments, they might celebrate another person's achievements with energy and encouragement, yet respond to yours with measured politeness. This difference is rarely dramatic enough to call out directly, but it creates a clear emotional contrast. Humans are extremely sensitive to variations in social warmth. Even when someone tries to hide their resentment, their emotional investment tends to reveal itself through where they place their attention and enthusiasm. Over time, you may notice that certain individuals are generous with praise toward others, but restrained when interacting with you. This selective engagement reflects an underlying tension that polite language alone cannot conceal. Another revealing element of secret resentment is the presence of subtle humor used as camouflage. Jokes and sarcasm provide a socially acceptable outlet for criticism. Because humor softens the tone, it allows someone to express negativity without appearing openly hostile. A person might frame a remark as playful teasing, yet the content of the joke consistently targets your competence, personality, or decisions. When these comments occur occasionally among close friends, they may simply be part of casual interaction. But when the humor consistently moves in one direction, toward undermining you, it begins to reveal something deeper. Psychologically, humor functions as a protective shield. If the comment receives a negative reaction, the speaker can immediately retreat by claiming it was just a joke. This defense preserves their social image while still allowing their resentment to surface in disguised form. And because society generally discourages overreacting to humor, many people tolerate these remarks longer than they should. Perhaps the most psychologically draining aspect of hidden resentment is its unpredictability. People who secretly dislike you rarely maintain consistent emotional signals. There may be moments where they appear friendly, supportive, or even enthusiastic. These moments create hope that the tension you sensed earlier was simply a misunderstanding. But then, without warning, the colder behavior returns. Subtle dismissiveness, quiet contradiction, or indifference. This inconsistency is what makes concealed hostility so mentally exhausting. The brain is wired to search for stable patterns in social relationships. When someone alternates between warmth and subtle negativity, the mind continuously tries to interpret their true intentions. Was that friendliness genuine, or just temporary politeness? Was the earlier tension real, or imagined? This internal questioning keeps your attention focused on the relationship far more than it should be. And ironically, the person harboring resentment often remains unaware of the psychological impact they are creating. From their perspective, they are simply behaving naturally. Their small actions feel justified because they believe their emotional response is reasonable. But beneath those justifications lies a deeper emotional reality. Unresolved insecurity, comparison, and the quiet discomfort of sharing space with someone who unintentionally challenges their self. Understanding these patterns does not mean becoming paranoid or assuming everyone secretly dislikes you. Human relationships are complex, and not every awkward interaction carries hidden hostility. But when certain behaviors repeat consistently over time, they begin to reveal the emotional structure beneath the surface. And recognizing that structure is essential, because the most powerful forms of resentment are rarely loud. They are quiet, controlled, and persistent, slowly shaping the dynamic of a relationship without ever declaring themselves openly. Once you start recognizing the subtle behaviors that reveal hidden resentment, another important question naturally emerges. Why do some people choose secrecy instead of simply expressing their dislike openly? On the surface, it might seem easier for someone to just admit they don't like you and move on. But human psychology rarely works that way. Most people are deeply concerned with how they are perceived by others. Social image plays a powerful role in shaping behavior. Even when someone feels strong resentment internally, openly displaying that hostility could damage their reputation, disrupt group harmony, or expose them to criticism. So instead of confronting the feeling directly, they manage it quietly. They maintain a polite exterior while allowing their frustration to surface in controlled, indirect ways. This allows them to protect two things at once: their social image and their emotional discomfort. And this is where the psychology becomes particularly revealing. Because hidden resentment is not just about disliking someone. It's about managing the internal conflict between how a person feels and how they want to be seen. When someone secretly hates you, they are often caught between two competing impulses. On one side is the emotional reaction, envy, insecurity, irritation, or perceived threat. On the other side is the desire to remain socially acceptable and maintain a reputation for being fair, kind, or reasonable. The solution their mind creates is subtle sabotage. Instead of confronting you directly, they slowly influence how others perceive you, how conversations unfold, and how attention flows in social settings. These actions are rarely dramatic. They are small, strategic adjustments that allow resentment to express itself without being obvious. One of the most common ways this appears is through narrative framing. People who secretly dislike you often reshape conversations in ways that influence how others interpret your actions. They might present a neutral situation with a slight negative spin, emphasize a minor mistake, or question your intentions in a subtle way. None of these actions appear openly malicious. In fact, they are often delivered in a calm, concerned tone that makes them seem reasonable. But psychologically, the effect is significant. Humans naturally form opinions based on repeated narratives. If someone consistently introduces small doubts about your character or competence, those doubts begin to accumulate in the minds of others. Over time, your reputation can shift without anyone realizing exactly why. This form of influence is particularly powerful because it operates beneath conscious awareness. The person spreading these subtle signals can always defend themselves by claiming they were simply sharing observations or expressing concern. Another strategy used by people who secretly resent you is emotional distancing. When resentment grows, genuine connection becomes difficult to maintain. But instead of withdrawing completely, they maintain a controlled level of interaction that preserves appearances while limiting closeness. Conversations become shorter, support becomes conditional, and emotional investment gradually decreases. This creates a relationship that feels superficially stable but lacks the warmth and trust that healthy connections normally have. Many people notice this shift but struggle to interpret it accurately. They sense that the relationship has cooled, yet there is no clear conflict to explain the change. This ambiguity can lead to instead of recognizing the other person's hidden resentment, individuals often turn inward and question their own behavior. They wonder if they did something wrong, if they misunderstood a comment, or if they are simply being overly sensitive. And this internal questioning benefits the person holding the resentment, because it shifts the psychological burden away from them. Rather than confronting their hostility, the focus moves toward your uncertainty. Another revealing aspect of secret hatred is the role of competition. Even in environments that appear cooperative, humans are constantly aware of relative status. Who receives recognition? Who influences decisions? Who attracts admiration? When someone perceives another person as a threat to their position in this invisible hierarchy, resentment can emerge quietly. But because overt rivalry might appear immature or aggressive, the competition becomes indirect. Instead of openly trying to outperform you, they may attempt to limit your influence subtly. This can happen through interrupting your ideas in group discussions, redirecting attention during conversations, or positioning themselves as the more reasonable or balanced voice in situations where your perspective is being considered. These actions are rarely dramatic enough to be noticed immediately, yet over time they shape how others perceive authority and competence within the group. The fascinating part of this dynamic is that the person engaging in it often sees themselves as justified. In their mind, they are not attacking you. They are simply protecting their own standing or correcting what they believe to be an imbalance. The human mind has a remarkable ability to reinterpret motives in ways that preserve self. Instead of acknowledging resentment, people frame their behavior as fairness, realism, or even responsibility. And because these justifications feel genuine to them, their actions appear calm and controlled rather than emotional or aggressive. Perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of hidden resentment is that it sometimes coexists with a certain level of admiration. This may sound contradictory, but it is actually quite common. A person may recognize qualities in you that they value: confidence, discipline, creativity, influence, yet feel uncomfortable about how those qualities affect their own self-image. That tension creates a strange mixture of respect and hostility. On one level, they acknowledge your strengths. On another level, they resent the discomfort those strengths create within them. As a result, their behavior fluctuates between occasional compliments and subtle criticism. To someone observing from the outside, the relationship may appear normal, but the emotional undercurrent remains unstable because the person has not resolved their internal conflict. They have not decided whether they admire you or resent you, so they unconsciously alternate between the two. Over time, this psychological tension often pushes the relationship toward distance. Because maintaining hidden resentment requires constant emotional management, the person must monitor their words, regulate their reactions, and maintain a social mask that hides their true feelings. This mental effort eventually becomes exhausting. Some people respond by gradually withdrawing from the relationship. Others continue the subtle competition indefinitely, allowing the resentment to persist quietly beneath the surface. And this is why understanding the psychology behind secret hatred is so important. Because the real issue is rarely about a specific action you took or a single conflict that occurred. In most cases, the resentment originates from internal dynamics within the other person: insecurity, comparison, status, anxiety, or unresolved identity struggles. Your presence simply activates those underlying feelings. Recognizing this shifts the entire perspective. Instead of constantly analyzing what you might have done wrong, you begin to see the interaction as part of a larger psychological pattern. And that awareness changes how you interpret subtle signals in your environment. Because once you understand the motivations behind hidden resentment, the behavior that once seemed confusing starts to make a lot more sense. Once you understand the deeper psychology behind hidden resentment, the final and most important question becomes how to respond to it without becoming consumed by it. Because one of the greatest traps in dealing with people who secretly dislike you is overreaction. Hidden hostility is designed to remain ambiguous. It rarely gives you enough evidence for a direct confrontation, yet it creates just enough tension to pull your attention toward it. And when someone begins reacting emotionally to that tension, becoming defensive, overly cautious, or constantly trying to win approval, the dynamic actually strengthens the power of the resentment. This is why the most effective response is not aggression or accusation, but awareness combined with emotional discipline. When you recognize that someone's subtle negativity is often rooted in their own insecurity rather than your actions, you stop interpreting every interaction as a personal attack. This shift in perspective is crucial, because people who secretly resent you often rely on one psychological reaction from you above all others: validation of their narrative. If they believe you are arrogant, insecure, or overly sensitive, an emotional reaction confirms that belief in their mind. But when you respond with calm consistency, instead of defensiveness, the pattern begins to lose its influence. Emotional control disrupts the psychological loop that hidden resentment depends on. Another powerful response is observation instead of engagement. Most people instinctively try to resolve tension in relationships by explaining themselves or seeking clarity. But with concealed hostility, explanations rarely solve the problem because the issue is not misunderstanding. It is internal resentment within the other person. Trying to argue your intentions or prove your character simply feeds the dynamic by giving them more attention and emotional investment. Instead, observation allows you to recognize patterns without being pulled into them. You notice the subtle contradiction, the passive comparison, the selective support, and the disguised criticism, but you no longer treat each instance as something that requires a response. Over time, this detachment changes the balance of the interaction, without emotional reactions to reinforce their behavior. The person holding the resentment often finds their subtle strategies less effective. Another essential skill is protecting your psychological boundaries. Hidden resentment frequently encourages self. When someone consistently responds to you with subtle skepticism or quiet criticism, it can slowly erode confidence if you internalize those signals too deeply. The human brain is extremely sensitive to social feedback. Repeated exposure to negative cues, even small ones, can gradually influence how you perceive yourself. This is why maintaining internal clarity about your values, abilities, and intentions is so important. When your self-perception is grounded in reality rather than constantly adjusted based on others' reactions, subtle hostility loses much of its impact. You stop measuring your worth through the approval of people who are already emotionally biased against you. Instead, you evaluate feedback based on its substance rather than its source. If a criticism is constructive and accurate, you can learn from it regardless of who delivers it. But if it stems from resentment or insecurity, you recognize it as a reflection of their internal state rather than a reliable judgment of your character. Another powerful strategy is selective distance. Not every relationship deserves equal access to your time, energy, or emotional openness. When you recognize a consistent pattern of hidden hostility, reducing unnecessary interaction often becomes the healthiest choice. This does not require dramatic confrontation or hostility in return. It can be as simple as shifting your focus toward people who demonstrate genuine respect and support. Human attention is a limited resource. Where you invest, it shapes the quality of your social environment. By naturally gravitating toward healthier connections, you gradually remove yourself from dynamics that rely on subtle tension and insecurity. This approach also reveals something important about people who secretly resent you. Much of their influence depends on proximity. When you create space, emotionally or physically, their ability to affect your mindset diminishes significantly. Over time, this distance often exposes the true nature of the relationship more clearly than confrontation ever could. Some individuals will quietly fade from your life when they realize their subtle influence no longer affects you. Others may attempt to re-establish connection once the tension loses its emotional leverage. But regardless of how they respond, your focus remains on preserving your internal stability rather than managing their feelings. Perhaps the most liberating realization in all of this is understanding that not everyone is meant to like you. Many people grow up believing that being kind, respectful, and cooperative should guarantee positive relationships with everyone they encounter. But human psychology is far more complex than that. People interpret the world through the lens of their own insecurities, ambitions, and identity struggles. Sometimes your presence alone can trigger reactions that have very little to do with your actual behavior. Accepting this reality removes a tremendous amount of unnecessary pressure. Instead of constantly adjusting yourself to avoid provoking resentment, you begin focusing on authenticity and personal growth. You invest your energy in becoming more competent, more aware, and more emotionally stable rather than trying to control how everyone perceives you. And ironically, this mindset often strengthens your presence even further. Individuals who maintain calm confidence in the face of subtle hostility project a form of psychological stability that others naturally respect. They do not chase approval, they do not over-explain themselves, and they do not collapse under quiet criticism. Their behavior communicates something powerful without needing to say it directly. Their identity is not defined by external validation. Ultimately, the hidden psychology of people who secretly hate you reveals far more about human nature than it does about you personally. It exposes how fragile self-image can be, how comparison shapes emotional reactions, and how easily resentment can hide behind politeness. But it also reveals something equally important about personal strength. The most powerful response to hidden hostility is not confrontation or retaliation. It is clarity. The clarity to recognize patterns without becoming consumed by them. The clarity to maintain self-respect without needing universal approval. And the clarity to direct your attention toward relationships built on genuine respect rather than silent competition. Because in the end, the people who quietly resent you only hold power as long as their behavior controls your reactions. The moment you understand the psychology behind their actions, that power begins to disappear. And once you truly understand this dynamic, something inside you begins to shift. Because the moment you recognize the hidden psychology behind quiet resentment, The confusion that once surrounded certain relationships starts to disappear. What once felt like a mysterious tension becomes something much easier to interpret. The cold enthusiasm, the subtle contradiction, the passive comparisons, the disguised humor that quietly undermines you, all of these behaviors stop feeling random and instead begin to reveal a consistent emotional pattern. And that realization is powerful, because clarity removes the need for constant mental analysis. When you no longer spend your energy trying to decode every subtle reaction, you regain something far more valuable: psychological freedom. Many people waste years of their lives trying to manage how others feel about them. They adjust their behavior, soften their opinions, limit their ambition, or dim their confidence in the hope of maintaining harmony with everyone around them. But hidden resentment exposes a fundamental truth about human nature: harmony cannot always be negotiated. Some people will feel threatened by your presence no matter how considerate you try to be. Some people will interpret your growth as competition. Others will quietly resent the confidence they wish they had themselves. And once you accept that reality, a different mindset begins to form. Instead of constantly asking, "How do I make everyone comfortable around me?" the question slowly changes to something far more important: am I living in a way that respects my own values? Because the pursuit of universal approval is one of the fastest ways to lose your sense of identity. When your behavior is constantly adjusted to avoid provoking resentment, you stop expressing who you actually are. Your words become filtered. Your ambitions become restrained. Your presence becomes smaller than it should be. And ironically, even that restraint does not eliminate resentment completely. People who struggle with insecurity rarely need a major reason to feel threatened. Sometimes your mere authenticity is enough. But when you stop trying to control other people's reactions, something interesting happens. The people who quietly resent you lose their influence over your internal state. Their subtle comments no longer shape your confidence. Their lack of enthusiasm no longer determines how proud you feel about your progress. Their quiet skepticism no longer dictates how boldly you express your ideas. You begin operating from a different psychological foundation, one rooted in self-respect rather than constant social calibration. And self-respect changes the way you move through the world. It allows you to remain calm when someone subtly tries to undermine you. It allows you to observe jealousy without absorbing it. It allows you to recognize hidden hostility without becoming consumed by anger or frustration. Instead of reacting emotionally, you simply adjust your awareness. You become more selective with your energy. You pay closer attention to patterns of behavior. You invest your time in people who celebrate your growth rather than quietly competing with it. And over time, this shift begins to reshape your environment. The relationships built on silent tension naturally weaken, while the ones built on genuine mutual respect grow stronger. Because the truth is, healthy connections do not require constant psychological defense. In relationships built on trust and respect, support flows naturally. Success is celebrated without hesitation. Differences in opinion lead to curiosity rather than subtle hostility. These relationships feel lighter, more stable, and far less draining because they are not fueled by insecurity or comparison. And once you experience that kind of connection, it becomes much easier to recognize when something else is happening beneath the surface. Hidden resentment loses much of its mystery when you've seen the difference between genuine support and polite competition. But perhaps the most valuable lesson in all of this is understanding that someone secretly disliking you is not automatically a failure on your part. In many cases, it is simply the side effect of being visible, capable, or authentic in environments where those qualities trigger comparison in others. The goal is not to eliminate these reactions completely. That would require controlling other people's internal struggles, which is impossible. The real goal is to develop enough self-awareness and emotional stability that those reactions no longer dictate your behavior or your sense of worth. Because when you stop carrying the burden of everyone else's hidden emotions, your energy becomes available for something far more productive: growth, creativity, discipline, the pursuit of meaningful goals, and perhaps most importantly, the cultivation of relationships where respect flows naturally instead of being quietly withheld. So if you ever feel that subtle tension around certain people, the sense that something beneath the surface is not quite genuine, don't ignore your intuition. Often, that instinct is your mind recognizing patterns your conscious thoughts have not fully processed yet. Pay attention to consistency. Observe behavior rather than just words. And remember that not every relationship is meant to be deep, trusting, or long. Some people are simply temporary participants in your life's environment, and once you see their role clearly, you no longer feel the need to fight for their approval or interpret their subtle negativity as a reflection of your value. Because your value is not determined by who secretly resents you. It is determined by how honestly you live, how consistently you grow, and how much respect you maintain for yourself even when others struggle to offer it. Now I'm curious about something. Think about the people in your life for a moment. Have you ever noticed these subtle patterns? The quiet contradiction? The lack of genuine support? The disguised criticism? Sometimes recognizing these dynamics can be uncomfortable, but awareness is always the first step toward protecting your peace. So tell me in the comments, What was the biggest sign that made you realize someone secretly disliked you? Your experience might help someone else recognize patterns they've been ignoring. And if this conversation made you see human behavior from a deeper psychological perspective, make sure to subscribe and stay connected, because the more you understand the hidden dynamics behind human nature, the harder it becomes for manipulation, jealousy, or silent hostility to control your life.